Thanks, Asim. I'm not going to repeat all the thanks that Asim has already mentioned. This book would definitely not have been possible were it not for not just all the people who actually helped in the last 3 or 4 years, but I think all the inspiration that movements, colleagues, activists, academics and so on have provided in the last 30 years or so of the work that I've been doing. Quite by accident this morning I was looking for something on the net and on the Narmada project, and I came across something that a bunch of us had written back in 1985, which is 27 years back. And I'm just going to read 3-4 lines from that. The process we've embarked on is not only ecologically non-sustainable, it is also socio-culturally destructive. This is basically a critique of the Narmada projects that we did back then when we were in college. It has increased inequalities, concentrated power in the hands of a few, swamped valuable traditional cultures and knowledge systems, destroyed the spiritual part in us, broken integrative social relationships, and isolated individuals from each other and from nature. Most damagingly, our fixation with this model of development has meant the neglect of all alternative forms of change, including the possibility of developing on time-tested, ecologically sound practices such as organic farming. Is this development? This is a question that we asked back then, and I feel in the writing of and the publication of this book that the question is not any different, but of course there's a lot more that we've learned in this journey in the last few decades, and it's become the conviction that the world is headed in the wrong direction has become that much stronger. Last week, a group of Ethiopians based in the US gave a submission, a memorandum to the Indian ambassador in the US, where the submission basically in detail argued how Indian companies and the government, with the support of the government, are actually grabbing land from farmers and pastoral communities in Ethiopia for commercial reasons. And it asked the Indian government to stop this forthwith. I don't know if the Indian government or the ambassador has in any way responded, but it's an interesting comment on the fact that India, which itself suffered massive colonial presence for more than 2 centuries, is now a colonizer. It's a colonizer of the external world, especially in Africa and increasingly in South America and Southeast Asia. And it's a colonizer internally. That is to say, the classes of people who actually have the power and the money are doing the same land grab and the same resource grab within the country as they are doing outside. We've documented quite a bit of this in the book, so I'm not going to go into detail. But if we just take the kinds of ecological impacts and social impacts of the rise in, for instance, the diversion of forest land for non-forest, for industrial purposes, infrastructure, etc., the rapid rise in commercial fisheries, especially for export, and its impacts on traditional fishing communities. You begin to see actually a trend which is very, very frightening. Of course, this is not something that's only with globalization. We did realize that the model of development which we brought about in India since the 1950s or 60s is to blame. But globalization has actually added new spins to it. It has considerably expanded and exacerbated and increased the pace of this kind of destruction that is taking place. And again, we have given quite a lot of evidence in the book of what's been happening in the last 20 years or so. But there are at least two crucial sort of analytical results or conclusions we've come to in this, which are what gives us the scare. And one of these is that, if you look at the West, it's interesting that while they went through the whole development process, they went through the same destruction of the environment and displacement of communities and so on. But they also brought into place very stringent environmental regulations. And of course, that did mean that their impacts were then outsourced. In the sense that they're plundering the rest of the world. In India, what's happening is that there is a significant weakening of environmental regulations. Many of us grew through this period in the 1970s and 80s of actually more regulations coming in. for good reasons, environment regulations, a lot of legislation, etc. coming in, ministry being created and so on. But if you look at 1991 onwards, you see a very clear trend of actually diluting even the regulations that were put into place in the 1970s and 80s. That's with the Environment Protection Act, with the Coastal Zone regulations, with all kinds of things. The Forest Conservation Act became a Forest Clearance Act, etc. The second very interesting thing that is that we've documented is in 1991, or was it 92, Dr. Manmohan Singh, who was at that point finance minister and brought in the so-called economic reforms, he gave a lecture on the economic reforms and the environment in New Delhi. And his main thesis was, his argument was that yes, we realize that economic reforms will have some environmental impacts. But if we don't have these reforms, we won't have the money to put into environmental protection. So we did an analysis for the book on how much money is actually gone into environmental protection by the government of India. And it's amazing. It's actually, as a share of the total budget, been steadily going down. It has never been more than 1% of the share of the total budget. And in fact, last year was the lowest ever share of the total budget that the environment got. And this includes not just the Ministry of Environment, but also things like non-conventional energy sources and so on. So, on the one hand, all this weakening is taking place. There's a massive impact on the environment and therefore on communities dependent on the environment. And on the other hand, government is actually not really doing what it's supposed to be doing in terms of what they say, amelioration and prevention and so on. I think it's very clear, and I think Kasim and I are both absolutely clear on this, and this is something that's been borne by a whole series of people in various subjects, that the model of development, and especially the globalized model of development, is just inherently unsustainable. You cannot be tinkering around with it and hope to protect the environment and protect people's livelihoods. It is inherently unsustainable. It has to fundamentally change. There is absolutely, in our minds, no doubt about this. So all this talk that is going on now about greening the economy and market solutions for the environment and climate clean development mechanisms and so on and so forth is basically hogwash. It's greenwash. It's not going to help solve the problems that have been created by this model of globalized development. It's only maybe slightly going to postpone the collapse. And actually worse, because it's going to make us believe that yes, there are these technological solutions, but actually they aren't there. They're unreal. They're fake. So the question that arises is, and that's the second part of our book, do we have an alternative? And as Asim very rightly said, there are actually second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, infinite numbers of alternative pathways by which human well-being can be achieved without, number one, destroying the environment, and number two, creating the kind of social economic inequalities that we see increasingly in India. We have in the book recorded a large number of initiatives, grassroots initiatives, at sustainability, whether it's with agriculture, it's with water, with livelihoods, with alternative education, health, etc. And we've argued that based on these grassroots alternatives, which are either very small or large or whatever at different scales, and also the kinds of policy changes that are increasingly being forced on the government, such as, for instance, the right to information legislation, we argue that that we can think of a radically different framework for, I hesitate to say development because the word development itself is problematic, but a radically different framework for human well-being. Human well-being that's based on also respecting nature and respecting the fact that human beings are not the only species on Earth. There are hundreds of thousands of more species, they need to be respected, but also respecting each other as human beings. We call this radical ecological democracy, a form of democratic decision-making that enables and empowers every citizen to be part of decision-making, to be part of decision-making that is ecologically sensitive and that is sensitive to each other, so that it's achieving forms of equity. We argue this is very eminently possible. There are certain values that are inherent in this, which are very different from the values that are in the globalized development framework that Asim talked about. These are values that respect each other. They are much more about about human happiness based on intangibles, on relationships, on collective thinking, working spirit, etc., rather than on material accumulation alone. They are values that talk about simplicity, which of course many people can define in very different ways. It's not about imposing anything from above, but simplicity as also being something that we value. The value of diversity, so that we're not talking about one homogeneous world where everybody is drinking Coca-Cola, and so on. So, we both think and believe that this is very much possible. Of course, we've been asked, that is this utopian? I mean, are you talking about, nice, it's a nice dream to actually talk about radical ecological democracy, but really, hone nahi wala hai, it's not possible. Our answer to that is very simple. First of all, we do see it happening on the ground, and we do think it's possible. It's going to be very difficult. It's going to take a long time. It probably won't even happen within the lifespan of Aseem and me, but it will happen. And in any case, the dream that is given to us by globalized development is a complete dystopia. It is something that's pushing us to collapse. So it is not in any way the sort of dream that we would want to be dreaming. So if ours is difficult, long-term, etc., we still prefer that, then to be actually getting into a nightmare of short-termism, which is going to take us towards all kinds of collapse. So that's our hope, and that's our I shouldn't even say vision. That sounds very big, but very tentative framework that we've put out, which is in the book. We hope to be working on this much more in the next few years, and basically, I think the inspiration for this comes from the struggles on the ground against destructive development and the struggles on the ground towards more constructive alternative ways of doing things. I think for both of us this has been quite an incredible journey, and we hope that those of you who do manage to go through the 400 pages, apologies in advance for making this 400 pages, but those of you who do manage to go through it would also be able to take part in a bit of this journey and help us to improve it, strengthen it, make it different if it needs to be in the next few years. Many thanks for this opportunity. Thank you. We'd like now to take this opportunity to welcome our panelists. We hope they're going to heat up the room, which is a bit cold right now, with their comments. What I'll do, I think, is to introduce each one of you and request you to speak, so one by one, rather than introducing everybody together, if that's okay with you. Not quite going by Indian tradition of the senior most first, we thought we'd request Amitabh to start off. Amitabh Aviskar is currently at the Institute of Economic Growth. Very well known, I don't know what to say, activist intellectual or intellectual activist. Has written and done some incredible work on so-called urban environmentalism and the poor and on water. And of course is a very old and dear colleague from Kalgoorlie, long back. It was one of our inspiring treks that we did through the Chipko movement area back in 1980, I think it was. So Amitabh, would you like to start off? Thanks. Yeah, sure.
It's a great pleasure to speak at this book launch. It's a book we've been waiting for a long time, following various always meeting Ashish and Aseem and saying, "Abhi tak hua ki nahi?" And they're saying, "No, abhi chal raha hai." So it's good to see it finally out in print. Congratulations. This is a difficult book to deal with because so much of it is indeed gloomy, and the kind of crisis and catastrophe they describe is very far away from the lives of most of us in this room. And therefore the way in which the detail sort of relentlessly adds up, which is very convincing detail, is something that one actually has to confront in a systematic way, and the book helps us to do that. But I think most of all I'm grateful to the authors for providing us with such a systematic and comprehensive understanding of the reality that confronts most people out there, people who are not like us, people who they call Bharat, and opposed to the India which is, or people mainly like us. I want to first speak about what I appreciated the most in this book, and I think the first notable achievement is that the book is challenge to mainstream economic thinking and to the mainstream economic establishment on its own terms. So it takes on the concepts that economists use, the data that economists put out, and it uses them to demolish their self-serving and mainly short-sighted policies. And I think the way in which the myth of free trade, the idea of gross domestic product, etc., is taken apart systematically in the book is something that will be of great value to a number of people who take these pronouncements at face value or give them a kind of authority that in fact they should not have. The book also marshals a very, very compelling account of ecological destruction as well as social havoc created by economic liberalization. A havoc that is summed up in the notion of two nations falling, which are joined at the hip. As you say, I think they're Siamese twins, but which are nevertheless being in some ways wrenched apart by the different directions in which they're growing. India, which is steaming ahead to new prosperity, and Bharat, which is constantly made to pay the price of the affluence of its twin. I also appreciated the book squarely put the spotlight on agriculture. And this is a field which has been systematically neglected. And in fact, I think the neglect is appalling given the importance of agriculture to sustaining not just the bulk of India's population, but also the very basis of our economy still. So the book has important elements of agricultural analysis in different chapters. And finally, I think the book is very important because it focuses on the role of the state in facilitating what's been called by David Harvey accumulation by dispossession. And this is in fact a crucial dimension of how the government facilitates the takeover of resources that in fact Harvey himself does not examine in his work. So I think the book does a marvelous job doing that. So those of us, and there are I think many people in this room who are familiar with this analysis and who tend to dismiss it as sort of no hope critique without any constructive suggestions for change, etc., would find that the book actually does offer a number of suggestions for how change, what change should look like, because it puts together this alternative model that it calls radical ecological democracy, RED. This is not a blueprint. They don't say what this will be like. But they describe a set of enabling conditions centered on the empowerment of Gram Sabhas, on bioregional planning at a smaller scale and so on, which will help bring about this radical ecological democracy. So I think the book is a valuable resource to those of us who are opposed to the relentless bulldozers of the growth is good brigade, and for those who are looking for ideas about how to craft a better world. The book is provocative and informative, and I think it gives us a lot to think about. Even as it provokes, it stimulates more questions in terms of how the analysis and the arguments are worked out. I'm going to address these questions to the authors, but I think other people too will raise them in different ways. One is what Ashish you called a utopia, the idea of radical ecological democracy, which stands before us as a vision to strive towards. I have no problem with utopias existing. We need them to inspire us. But I don't think the book actually tells us how we can move towards RED. You say that RED is in some ways the vision of all of Bharat, and the question is, can Bharat influence India when so far, despite its overwhelming power in terms of numbers which should surely be significant in an electoral democracy, Bharat has been unable to actually make very much headway. Even though there's some clear evidence that some communities, especially in Andhra Pradesh and Kerala that you document in the book, and some social movements as well, are actively striving towards the model that you call RED. What about the majority? Does all of Bharat want radical ecological democracy? And then I think there are two major challenges that the book or the discussion following the book needs to deal with. One that the struggles to describe are mainly local struggles, which haven't yet linked up to issues that drive electoral party politics. To some extent, the Right to Information did, the Rural Employment Guarantee Act did, the Forest Rights Act did. But a new deal for farmers, I don't see that happening, even though farmers and farm-related livelihoods are still a major part of what people in this country do. When one looks at an effective check in terms of common land alienation for mining or coastal projects, etc., or for that matter, concerted demand for low-income housing in cities, why is it that even though we see these as widespread demands, they still don't add up to issues which can make electoral party politics tick in a way that doesn't seem to be the case? Second, and I think you will probably not agree with me on this, but I think we have to reckon seriously on how the globalization model speaks to and shapes the desires of all kinds of people, including those in Bharat. That people's understanding of what constitutes the good life and how it is to be struggled for is rather different from what you might attribute to them in terms of where their interests and their ideologies ought to be. I think this hegemonic power that globalization represents is the single most important element standing in the way of reimagining the world. If the spin doctors who legitimize globalization are mainstream economists and are suave, educated politicians like Manmohan Singh or Chidambaram or Montek Singh Ahluwalia, etc., I think those who sell globalization to the poor, corporations, especially the media and advertising, and who are making their fortunes by those they describe as being at the bottom of the pyramid, are even more seductive and therefore insidious. So, the idea that you can bridge the consumption differences between Bharat and India, the faint and I think for the most part false hope that globalization offers to people, and the ways in which it also undermines collective action by suggesting individual strategies for mobilization. I think these are very, very serious aspects of how globalization works that need to be taken into account when one thinks about how one might struggle against it. Because to assume that people are already in a way conscious of radical ecological democracy and that is their utopia is, I think, not realistic in today's world. But speaking of utopias, I think the book is important because it takes us constantly back to Gandhi as well as to Tagore, and keeps reminding us that there are other ethical and political traditions in our country to which we might look for inspiration as well as for anchoring how we live in the world today and in the future. Thank you.